Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar on the opportunities for migrant seasonal workers' rights under a new government that's being hosted by Focus on Labour Exploitation, or FLEX. I am just going to run you through a little bit of the kind of agenda beforehand, so you know the structure of the event, and then also kind of some rules and instructions for how to ask questions and that type of thing as well. So in terms of the order for today's event, I'm going to be giving kind of the welcome, introductions, and the background. My name is Oliver Fisher. I'm the research manager at Focus on Labour Exploitation. And then following that, we're going to be having a group of presentations, kind of covering different aspects around the seasonal worker scheme or kind of labour market enforcement in the UK. So each of the speakers is going to speak for about 7 minutes. So we're going to start with Mariko, and then we have Armand, Anita, Matt, and Kate. And then following that, we are going to have a Q&A section, and then kind of a wrap up at the end as well. And this is the current order of who will be speaking today. In terms of a few notes for today's event, so Flex, or Focus on Labour Exploitation, will be sharing some kind of links and resources in the chat as we go along to kind of some of our reports and publications, just so you have those at hand if you want to check them after the webinar. As the webinar progresses, people should be able to submit questions through the Q&A function. And to increase the likelihood of questions being addressed, please submit them as we're going along. And then once you've submitted them during the Q&A section, I'll be assigning those to different panel members or the entire panel to kind of respond to those. This webinar is also being recorded, but at present it's only the kind of speakers or the hosts that are visible during that recording, so you won't kind of be shown during that. This will also be uploaded online a little bit later on as well, so we can send you a link to that afterwards if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with any of your colleagues who was not able to make the event. So just as a little bit of a background to the webinar, so as I mentioned, I'm from Focus on Labour Exploitation, or FLEX. We're a UK-based charity that was founded in 2013, and we focus on research and policy with a vision of a world free from all forms of labour exploitation, including forced labour and human trafficking. We predominantly focus on working to prevent labour abuses, protecting the rights of exploited and at-risk workers, and promoting best practice responses to labour exploitation. And we often have a large focus on kind of labour migration routes, and particularly on kind of temporary migration programs as well. So just as a little bit of a background to this session, for those who aren't aware, the seasonal worker visa, it's a temporary migration program that's been around for a few years now, quite a few decades, I guess, in terms of various different capacities, but most recently was introduced in 2019. It's a visa to bring workers in to the UK to work in horticulture for up to 6 months at a time, or poultry production for about 2.5 months. It started as a pilot in 2019 with about 2,500 visas. It's kind of quite rapidly expanded since then, and is now up to, I guess, 45,000 visas for next year. And it's currently being confirmed up until the end of 2029. There's quite a few restrictions in place for workers on this visa. So there's no path to settlement for workers. So they kind of come in for 6 months, go back home, or 2 months for poultry. As I was discussing, they kind of can't settle here or stay permanently. They don't have access to things like public funds and services. They're tied to a specific scheme operator who is a visa sponsor, who is in charge of bringing them into the UK, and then also in charge of their worker welfare, and they can only be kind of placed at farms that this operator places them on. At Flex, we've been providing analysis on this visa route since it was first announced back in 2018. We wrote and kind of conducted the first independent study on the route, which was published in 2021, which was focused on an assessment of the risks of forced labour and kind of labour exploitation in Scotland. Some of the, I guess, results leading on from that research publication, there was kind of updated guidance following our study and the banning of zero-hour contracts. The Scottish Government also established an independent helpline for workers as well. And then more recently, we've released a series of reports on making this scheme safer and fairer, predominantly focusing on England. So I think my colleague will put the reports in the chat, but we've also just launched today a kind of summary of those free publications as well. And they focused on things like recruitment related issues, access to redress, or kind of ways that workers can get help once they have if they have any issues in the UK, and then also looking at working and living conditions. And to the best of our knowledge, this is the largest independent sample of workers on the route. So we conducted surveys with around 400 workers and also conducted around 80 interviews, as well as with a bunch of kind of key stakeholders as well. So with kind of scheme operators, retailers, organizations that provide support as well. Some of these organizations are with us here today that kind of collected data and provided outreach for the program. So SEAC, Rosemead Centre Wisbech, and Citizens Advice South Lincolnshire. And I suppose today what we wanted to focus on a little bit is to kind of highlight some of the current challenges that we've been seeing on this visa route, and then also lead that to a discussion on, what can we do moving forward to make this route safer and fairer, and kind of what opportunities there are for the new government as well in terms of improving workers' rights, in terms of improving access to redress from workers as well. So that's just like a little bit of a brief introduction to the session, to the kind of visa route. And now for the next session, I'm going to be passing on to a couple of my colleagues here to give some presentations on a few different areas of the visa route. So I'll stop sharing now, but first I would like to introduce you to Mariko Hayashi, who's the Executive Director at the Southeast and East Asian Centre, or SEAC. Mariko has about 15 years of experience in project management, community organising, research and advocacy around migration and various human rights issues in the UK, Japan, as well as several other East and Southeast Asian countries. She continues to engage with policy advocacy with a particular focus on labour migration in and from East and Southeast Asia. Mariko is currently responsible for strategizing and overseeing the overall operations and programs of SEAC, and also worked with us on data collection and outreach for this project. So welcome to Mariko.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for the introductions, and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Mariko, as been introduced, and the Southeast and East Asian Centre, or SEAC, we are a non-profit community organisation led by and for migrants and refugees and people seeking asylum from Southeast Asia and East Asian countries who are now living in the UK. And we work to achieve our vision for our members of our communities to be treated as equal member of a society and to enjoy improved livelihood and social mobility. And alongside providing direct support services to individual community members, our also involvement in research and advocacy work also aim to contribute to the improvement of livelihood of migrants and refugees at the policy level. And the last 2 years, we had a great opportunities to work with the Flex, unpacking the experiences of workers under the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Visa Scheme, for us particularly working with those coming from Indonesia. And the research work that we conducted with the Flex was carried out from October 2022 and September 2023. And in 2022, our staff members actually visited some of the farms and spoke directly with the workers from Indonesia. We spoke with about around 37 workers. And while in 2023, when most of these workers had already come back to Indonesia, we conducted an ongoing interview with them, mostly online and in person, with only a few ones who stayed here. So yeah, we found a few initial participants through social media or the direct connections, the few connections that we had, and the majority of informants were found through the network of the initial participants. So I would like to share a few, I will talk through a few key issues that we found from our conversation with Indonesian agricultural workers, particular focus on the recruitment process of their before they're coming to the UK. So the first thing, the main issues that we found was that the high fees has been charged to workers during the recruitment process. So in their country of origin, in this case in Indonesia, the migrant workers were charged fees associated with the recruitment, amounting from about 2,500 until 6,000 pounds, which have put many of them in a huge debt. And these fees were much beyond the visa fees and international flights ticket, which was already quite expensive. These fees actually charged to migrant workers included various documentation such as medical assessment, insurance, travel documents and certificates, and training fees, even though the workers told us that they had very little or no training that they received. The workers also paid for their travel costs from their hometowns or home villages to the recruitment centers or agencies which were located in the cities, and accommodation fees and living costs outside of their hometowns during this recruitment process, and while waiting for their departure to the UK. As Indonesia is the world's largest archipelagic country, extending over 5,000 kilometers, so this domestic travel can actually involve movement between islands, taking multiple means of transportations, and either stated or not stated in the contract with their recruitment agents, or explained clearly to the workers or not, these costs were borne by the migrant workers. And to fill these geographical gaps and information gaps, there are multiple intermediaries involved in the recruitment process, making the cost charged to the workers extortionate. And without clear fee structures, regulations in place, the workers were put in a situation where they had no choice but to pay what they've been told to pay. And I also want to highlight that in 2022, it was the very first year for Indonesian workers to be recruited to the UK under this scheme. So the workers did not have any reference from anyone because they were the first ones to come to the UK. And so this situation has put them in debt bondage. So in order to finance recruitment related costs, many of the workers said they sold their assets at home, taking up loans from immediate or extended family members, friends and neighbors. And in a less common case, one worker told us that he borrowed money from a bank by using his family house as a collateral. So several workers also claimed that the debt collectors of loan sharks have been visiting their families to intimidate them. And also, being in debt makes the workers highly vulnerable to exploitations and put them at the high risk of modern slavery and irregularities. And the other things that we found was there are a lot of practices of deceptions during the recruitment process. So most of the workers we spoke with had been promised a 6-month job placement with at least 8 hours of work guaranteed based on the hourly pay. However, when they arrived in the UK, some workers found themselves being paid only based on the number or amount of the fruits they collected. And if there were less fruits to pick because of bad weather or because they missed the harvest seasons, their pay would decrease. So the workers had to work as many additional hours as possible so they can pick more fruits. Otherwise, they wouldn't earn what they have been told by working 8 hours a day. And also there were some cases where workers were terminated because they were considered as unproductive or not productive enough, leaving them jobless only after a few weeks or a couple of months arriving in the UK. And in these cases, they were not able to return home immediately or find a new job elsewhere, as they did not receive adequate assistance to repatriate or change employers. And while they had to pay for but during this time, they had to pay their own living expenses, accommodation costs, while left in limbo. So some workers has also been told that they would be able to return to the UK next summer and have paid additional fees for multi-year recruitment. However, there was not such a guarantee in reality. So these workers were not informed of these possibilities during the recruitment process that happened back home. And debt bondage and deceptions are both included in the International Labour Organization's indicators of forced labor. Unfortunately, majority of workers we spoke have experienced these in their recruitment process. So from us for improvement, we would like to suggest that the labor migration scheme must consider carefully the vulnerability of migrant workers in the infrastructures and procedure in both home countries and the UK. And these infrastructures and procedure can be both formal and informal, and which can be deeply rooted in the social, cultural, economic situation of the home countries, as well as the immigration scheme here in the UK. So the migrant workers face various challenges, not only while in the UK, but also before they come here and also after they return home. And today I don't have time to discuss this, but SIAC actually also supported the workers who continue to face challenges related to this visa scheme after they return home. So yeah, we urge for the better protection of migrant workers in all stages of migration process to join the UK's workforce and also to be included in this workers' rights that the new government is committed to. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Mariko. I'm going to pass on to Armand Maraz now from Citizens Advice South Lincolnshire. So Armand is currently working as a generalist outreach advisor for Citizens Advice Lincolnshire, predominantly focusing on that Lincolnshire area. We worked at Flex with Armand for about 1.5 years during the research project or publications that we were mentioning previously. So he was conducting kind of interviews, surveys, and kind of outreach activities with workers on the seasonal worker scheme. And apart from this, he's also within his role been focusing on other kind of migration or settlement related aspects, working on the resettlement of Ukrainian refugees in the UK. So welcome, Armand.
Hello, everybody. So thank you, Oliver, for inviting me to this presentation, to this meeting. And as Oliver already explained, so I work for Citizens Advice in South Lincolnshire, primarily focusing on people from helping people from Holbeach, Bourne, Market Deeping, and Stamford areas. So previously I did a Ukraine settlement project, and prior to that, we worked with Flex for about 1.5 years. So it was from July 2022 until October 2023. So initially, it was supposed to involve primarily face-to-face engagement in Lincolnshire, but thanks to a highly successful online engagement on platforms like Telegram, WhatsApp, and Instagram, I ended up covering most of England and some parts of Scotland as well. So during my research, I connected with over 600 workers and managed to interview 32 of them, and also completed 175 qualitative surveys. So out of all those people, approximately 85 people were referred to either food banks, the GLAA, the British Red Cross, and their respective embassies if they needed help returning to their home country. Well, the majority of workers I engaged with were from Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. If I can share the screen just to show you a breakdown of nationalities, to give you a better overview of can you see the screen? So yeah, as I said, predominantly Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Belarus, Russia. People from Russia, when I started the survey, there were still some people remaining in the UK, and when the war started, then after that, nobody else was allowed to come. So Russia could be actually taken out of this list now. A few key issues that I found during the research that affected almost everybody that I spoke to. The majority of workers lived in extremely cramped and unsanitary conditions, and often lacking access to water. Up to 7 people shared a single toilet. and also it's shared as a shower. So workers frequently expressed concerns about being placed in mixed gender caravans with other strangers. It was also very cold and very humid during winter, and people faced language barriers to actually report any of these issues. Not only because of the language barrier, because of fear of, let's say, retaliation from the employers. They didn't want to complain and report it. They needed to keep working there and use every day productively to be able to earn at least something to cover the expenses back home. The other thing that was really a concern for everybody was a piece rate salary. It was very, very confusing for everybody to work out what they are paid or how many hours they were paid. And they were not even sure whether they're underpaid or overpaid. And they were told they were paid the right amounts, but it didn't feel like it. There was nobody to actually give them explanation of how the piece rate works. Even I myself, I still don't understand how it works. So. The other thing that affected the people's earnings were the quality of the product and whether there were enough crops. Also, as Marika mentioned, the weather played a major role in that. So when the product quality was better, workers received a higher rate. But to earn anything during the period while picking low quality products, workers had to work faster and longer hours to be able to earn as much as they could have if the weather was great and the product was of better quality. In my research, I compiled some data, and about 80% of workers raised issues about unacceptable living conditions in caravans and unavailability of showers and toilets. This figure actually might be higher because some workers had more important issues to focus on, and they kind of neglected their well-being that was impacted by caravan conditions. The other major problem that affected mostly Uzbekistani and Kazakhstani, Tajikistani and Kyrgyzstan workers were inhumane treatment from supervisors who were mostly Romanian or Bulgarian. I think it's also the issue of the religion and culture, because I did not observe this problem among people from like Bulgaria, Romania, or Poland. Only from people from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. Only they share the issues. They were treated less fairly. And 99% of the surveyed workers were frightened to actually share their concerns about ill treatment at work, just because they were afraid of their employers or scheme operators that they might be released from work, and also, more importantly, not being able to return next year, because the majority of workers really cared kind of to leave, to have a good track record, to be able to return next year and reserve the spot, so they are recommended by the scheme operator to the farm. While workers came to the UK to work as many hours as possible, but due to lack of work or because of weather conditions, they couldn't even earn enough to cover their travel expenses. And as a result, they sometimes ended up working illegally elsewhere and overstaying their visas, because of the financial situation, and they couldn't return back home. About half of the seasonal workers that I interviewed, they felt that there was favoritism going on. For example, I already mentioned this earlier, the Romanian supervisors treating like non-Romanian workers less fairly in terms of working days given, the piece rate calculations, and also overtime availability. Something else that I observed during my work with seasonal workers, the workers who started as Oliver mentioned, when the pilot was launched, 2019, some of the workers have been coming almost every year, even though once their visa runs out, there's a certain time of period they have to wait until they reapply again. And by the time they can reapply, the next year's season is coming to an end. But some workers have managed to come back the next year or even the year after that. And those who have managed, they've told me when I got in touch with them that there has been very little or no improvement in their working and living conditions over the last 4 years. And some even said that the situation has worsened since the UK left the European Union. If people have been here working in the past as seasonal workers, so they haven't seen any improvement. For that reason, many workers actually refuse to participate in the research, as they do not believe it will lead to any changes. So that would be my summary. If there's anything else I should mention, Oliver, please let me know.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Armand. And as I mentioned in the beginning, but maybe if a few people join late, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A.
Yeah, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
And Armand, if you could please stop sharing, and then I'll pass on to the next speaker. Thank you. So thank you very much. I am now going to pass on to Anita Grobkiewicz from Community Centre Wisbech. So Anita is the Community Centre Manager at Rosmini Centre Wisbech, and has been with them for about 16 years now. And this centre is a community-based centre. It kind of provides support and advice to local communities with a particular focus on migrant communities. And this covers subjects such as kind of employment support, translation, food poverty, and hate crime. And we also worked alongside Anita and the centre with some other, I guess, people doing data collection and outreach on the same project that we worked with Armand on as well. So Anita, welcome. And Anita will be speaking a little bit more on kind of access to redress or kind of difficulties in accessing support for workers in the UK.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for asking me to come along today. Okay, so I'm here with two hats, really. One is having worked on the seasonal worker project with Flex, and the other hat is as a community centre manager. I'm just going to set my timer because I don't want to over talk here. So we have approximately 2,000 to 3,000 people come through every year, and they have all sorts of problems and issues, primarily migrant workers. Where we are in Wisbech, we're on the border of Norfolk, Cambridgeshire and Lincolnshire. So we get people from 3 different counties coming to us. I totally agree with everything that Artem and Marika have just explained to you, because we've come across all of those things as well. But what I wanted to do today was just to talk through what happens when it goes wrong. So I'm going to put my community centre hat back on and explain that we had 7 guys last year, about late September time, come from Kazakhstan. They were given 2 weeks work by the scheme operator in a small village quite close by. Well, they were given work, shall we say. The work only lasted for 2 weeks, and then they were given a week's notice to leave the caravan. So their return flights weren't booked until February. So this was end of September, beginning of October. There are lots of things you've heard about Telegram, Instagram. In the process with my other hat back on, the Flex hat, we came across a lot of horrible things on, non-informative things. We were thrown off of sites because we asked too many questions. So we knew there was the people who go on those sites were very vulnerable. 6 of the guys, 6 of the 7, decided that there was no way. He'd contacted the scheme operator and they had all been told by the scheme operator, you need to find your own work. So those ones had already moved on to look for work. One decided to stay, and he was the one that came to the Rosmini Centre. He was aware that he was going to be vulnerable. The same as the other guys, he didn't want to go looking for work. We tried the scheme operator because we know that the scheme operator is the one that should be giving him work, but they wouldn't help. Again, he was told, you know, find your own work. We then contacted DEFRA. DEFRA told us it wasn't their problem. We needed to contact the GLAA. We contacted the GLAA, who told us it wasn't their problem. We needed to contact DEFRA. We contacted the Salvation Army. We contacted the Red Cross. We went back to DEFRA, who told us that we needed to contact the local authority, failing that, the local police. We contacted the local authority. Obviously, we were told, which we already knew, there was no recourse to public funds. So he wasn't going to get any help. We didn't want to go to the police because, as far as we're concerned, he hadn't actually committed a crime. This was the fact that he'd not, you know, hadn't got work. He explained to us he had debts, he had borrowed from family and friends, and he didn't feel that he could go home and face people with the shame of not having the money to pay back. At that point, he'd also been around local agencies, and obviously local agencies can't employ people who are on a seasonal worker scheme, so that was a dead end. We, through this project, we actually, where we'd been interviewing people, we knew which other farms there were locally who were using the same scheme operator. So as a last resort, we thought maybe if we contact those farmers, see if they have any work, we could then act on his behalf by trying to get the scheme operator to move him officially to the farms. But they were in the same position. The pumpkins was coming to an end, and they were actually letting people go as well. So, you know, it seems as if there must have been a huge amount of people that were, you know, all suffering the same problems. So we spent 3 days trying to get support and help. And sorry, I can't disconnect that phone. Yeah, so we spent 3 days trying to get help. He didn't fit the modern day slavery role, so there was no support there. In the end, we decided, myself and staff, that we would actually raise the money to buy his ticket because he wasn't able to change the date of the ticket. But as I say, he said no, he couldn't go home and face the fact that he wasn't able to pay back family and friends, and he joined the others. So none of these guys wanted to be working other than on their scheme, but they weren't given the work. Their hours were cut short, their jobs were cut short. They were given a week's notice to vacate premises. And that 7th guy actually spent 3 nights. He told us he was staying with a friend, but he was sleeping in a shop doorway. And I think it's, you know, from our point of view, it's horrendous that we're seeing people coming through and suffering those sort of issues. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita, for sharing those experiences. I'm going to pass on to Matt Cray now, who's an Employment Rights Policy Officer at the Trades Union Congress. So his work covers labour market enforcement, kind of employment tribunal fees and family-friendly rights. And kind of before this current iteration of his role, he was project managed the TUC's Union Modernisation Fund project on precarious employment, and currently leads research to better understand the challenges young working parents face. He also previously worked in the learning and skills arm of the TUC Union Learn, helping unions negotiate good quality apprenticeships with employers. So welcome, Matt.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. I just wanted to give the trade union perspective on some of the issues with the current scheme, and then perhaps to finish off with some of the reasons we've got to be hopeful that some positive reforms are underway. So I think first of all, I just wanted to say that before any sort of tweaks are made to the scheme, I think we need to look at some fundamental reforms, particularly around the length of the visa. So we find that short-term visas are much more likely to lead to the exploitation of workers. And it's got a number of knock-on effects, practical effects for the trade unions trying to organise those workers as well. Firstly, workers are much less likely to want to join a union if they're only here for a short time and know that they're going to be returning home soon. It also prevents unions from having practical access to workers. 6 months is quite a short time to find out where the workers are, which farms they're on, They can often be at remote locations, and then trying to get an organising team out to speak with the workers. And then a 6-month visa, it also makes it really unlikely that workers are going to try and enforce their rights. So some employment rights have to be brought to an employment tribunal, and we know there are lengthy delays bringing a claim to tribunal. So it might be likely that the workers returned home before their claim would even be heard by a tribunal. And the same goes for trying to bring a claim to an enforcement body. It might not be likely that that claim's dealt with within 6 months. And then I think another point is that it's not actually necessary to have a 6-month work visa. The workers are here doing seasonal work, but seasonal work is available all year round. And that's a point that's been acknowledged by the NFU, the employer body for farmers as well. So I think there could be a joint sort of call that we don't need 6 months visas and workers should be given a great more deal of security. The second area where we think there should be a much greater focus is on compensation for workers. All the speakers so far have talked about the real problems which workers face, but around wage theft and debt bondage, I think Mariko pointed out that a lot of workers make huge sacrifices, and their families as well, often selling things to afford the visa fees and recruitment fees. And then they come here and the employer says, actually, you haven't got any work, and the workers bears the brunt of that. So we'd like to see things around an income guarantee. So if workers are promised work for 6 months, then they know they're going to receive the income for 6 months. And also the greater use of reparation orders by the court as well. So if someone's a victim of modern slavery, the court doesn't just punish the employer, it actually says, well, that worker's been exploited. We're going to get the money back that worker should have earned. And those Section 8 reparation orders, they're not used as widely as they should be. So we want to see those used a bit more widely, and you could give guidance to judges to do that. And I think it's also important to note that since April 2023, the immigration rules set by the Home Office actually state that a seasonal worker must receive a minimum of 32 hours pay for each week of their stay in the UK. So that is a Home Office rule they've set themselves, but it's not enforced, and it should be. And I think that goes on to the next point where I wanted to say I think there are areas we can be hopeful that there should be some positive reforms underway. So the new Labour government has made several encouraging commitments in their New Deal for working people that I think are related to seasonal workers and should provide some help there. And I think these address some of the issues that I need to raise specifically. So I think the first one is around right to access workplaces. So Anita talked about how some community organisers might feel vulnerable going to visit farms and not being made welcome by the employers and workers being afraid to speak with them. Well, under the Labour proposals, we hope that union officials and reps will have a right to access workplaces, and the employer will have to let them in, and they'll have a right to speak with and organise workers. We think that'll have a number of positive effects. I think firstly, a union rep or official won't have to rely on a tribunal or an enforcement body. They can go in, speak to the employer and resolve the workplace issue quickly. But they can also then start negotiations with employers about improving the terms and conditions that seasonal workers are on. So one of the speakers talked about piece rates. So just a practical example of where unions could negotiate around that. They could negotiate a base, and this is where unions in the agricultural sector have negotiated around this before. So they could say, well, there's going to be a base rate of pay for everyone, and then a piece rate bonus that could be on top of that. So workers aren't worried about earning below the national minimum wage because of piece rates, for example. And then I think the second major area that Labour are looking at, which will help seasonal workers, is around strengthening labour market enforcement with a new Fair Work agency. So I think there are a few key benefits here. I need to mention about how workers are passed between DEFRA, GLAA, Home Office, different enforcement bodies. Well, with a new Fair Work agency, it will encompass all of those, and it'll be a one-stop shop, and they can't pass the buck. So you will go to that enforcement body, and they will have to deal with the problem. Secondly, there's going to be unions, and also we have worker organisations on the governance structures. And they will have a say in the strategy and operational priorities for enforcement, so we can make sure that seasonal workers are better protected. It will provide an opportunity to have new powers. So at the moment, you've got a very sort of haphazard map of different powers across the enforcement bodies. And for example, the Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority has a right to enter workplaces, but only in licensed sectors. So where they operate a licensing scheme. So with the introduction of a Fair Work Agency, it's an opportunity to say that all inspectors in any sector have a right to enter workplaces and find out what's going on. So an inspector could go to a farm and investigate. And then also, I think, opportunities to have new sanctions. So punishing employers who breach the law, provide a proper deterrent. And then also importantly, I think removing labour market enforcement functions from UK visa and immigration, which is based in the Home Office, and bring it into the Fair Work Agency, because we know that when UKVI go to workplaces, their focus is on immigration enforcement and not on employment rights enforcement. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matt. I'm going to pass on to my colleague Kate now, who is the head of policy at Flex. So Kate leads on all our policy work. She has over 15 years relevant experience in workers' rights, campaigning, and advocacy, as well as anti-trafficking work. So Kate previously worked as UK and Europe manager at Anti-Slavery International and head of the Human Trafficking Foundation. Kate's also worked at Calayan, where she gave immigration and employment advice to migrant domestic workers in the UK, as well as leading the organization's policy and campaigning work. So Kate's now going to, I guess, summarize a few of the key issues that all the speakers have been talking about and link that in as well.
Yeah, thank you for introducing me, Oliver. I'll be brief because you've already, everyone on the call's done a lot of listening. And I don't want to duplicate too much what others have said, but just to sum up. I really second what Matt in particular said around how there is hopefully now a time to be optimistic about opportunities to improve the situation for agricultural seasonal workers in the UK. The panel have been really, really clear about the multiple issues affecting these workers. But at the same time, the new government has been very clear that workers' rights are a priority for it. Matt has set out the New Deal for working people and how this could, if implemented with considering this learning from the seasonal worker visa scheme, how it could benefit those workers. Matt also talked about the Fair Work Agency, which again should really end the current fragmentation of labour market enforcement. It should have powers to proactively inspect and enforce, so that the onus isn't on workers to take the risks and speak out. And enforcement should work in workers' interests and provide them with redress. And we also had an employment bill set out in the King's speech, which we understand will aim to address exploitation and promote workers' rights. And then it's really important that the learnings as shared by the panel today from workers' experiences of the seasonal worker visa make sure these government commitments deliver in practice for migrant workers. Just very briefly, the panel has explained how how the issues affecting workers are interrelated, and they are really compounded by the very restrictive and short-term nature of the visa. So with a more flexible visa, a worker might experience one issue, but it might be possible to mitigate that. For example, I mean, of course, all workers should be able to access their rights, but with fewer restrictions, that is far more possible. For example, a worker whose work is cut short sooner than they expected, if their visa allowed them to work in any job, they could then they could move. They'd be less adversely affected by their work being far shorter than they expected, or there being less work than they expected. Or if they had a longer time on their visa, again, they'd have more options to look for work and improve their situation. But the current situation is that without these options, the worker constantly has the risk that they may have to return home without having earned enough to pay off migration debts. And as others, as the panel have explained so well, this actually acts as a barrier to complaining, because the worker feels, they make the judgment that making a complaint actually may carry more risk for them than keeping their head down and trying to at least come back in another season. So just to wrap up very quickly, because I know we need time for the Q&A, just to say, that with a strong commitment to workers' rights from government, I do agree with Matt that there is a reason to be hopeful. The route has also been confirmed until 2029, so that there really is, it really is vital to make sure that the route is safe and fair and actually works well for everyone. So Flex is a member of the seasonal worker interest group, and we have called, collectively, the group has really called for a thorough review of the seasonal worker scheme, the structure of the scheme in its entirety, to uphold the rights of workers rather than incremental reforms. So rather than to actually address the root causes of some of the risks to workers, rather than always reacting to manifestations of these risks. Others have mentioned specific recommendations, and these are also set out in the 3 reports and the executive summary, which has been shared in the chat. There are a lot of recommendations because the scheme, because all the issues are interconnected. So I won't repeat them here, but rather I think it is important to talk about the principles we need to be looking at when considering fundamental reforms to the structure of the visa to make sure it upholds workers' rights. And these must consider who pays the migration costs. The UK recognises that these workers are essential to our horticultural industry, so we need to invest in them. The duration of the visa, Matt's already spoken about this, but with no option at the moment to recognise migrant workers' skills in the context of labour shortages and renew visas in the UK. This leaves workers this doesn't work well for workers or for employers, with workers having to always go back and forth and not be able to really build on their skills and experience in the UK. At the same time, we can't expect workers to migrate without any certainty of work throughout the 6 months of their visa. We do need to guarantee workers work if we're asking them to make the commitment to come here, or we need to also make sure they have more flexibility to find other work if work isn't forthcoming. We can't have the situation where workers are being asked to migrate without certainty that there will be work available. Anita spoke about the lack of clarity around government responsibility for the scheme. And we really do need clarity on this, supported by proactive inspections and independent monitoring. The ICIB, the Independent Chief Inspector for Borders and Immigration, documented really thoroughly the lack of clarity around responsibility as well. And then, in line with Matt's comments about organising workers also need access to independent information and advice, as well as redress options and justice options that work for them in practice. So, we're in a period now where the scheme has been in place since it was most recently piloted in 2019 for several years now. It has been confirmed until 2029, and now is really the time to make sure that the government's commitments to workers' rights really do deliver for all workers, including workers on this scheme. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate, and to all the previous speakers as well. As I mentioned, we're going to be moving into the Q&A section now. So if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function. So I'll give people a couple of minutes to do that. But while people are putting in questions, I suppose I wanted to ask a question to the panel, actually following on from some of the previous discussion from, I guess, Kate and Matt, in terms of the Fair Work Agency. I was just wondering what your, I guess, perspectives were on kind of what are some of the kind of priorities or things that need to be embedded within the Fair Work Agency to make sure that workers can access redress in practice, and why is this important?
Do you want to go first, Matt, or do you want me to?
You want to go first, Kate? Sorry, I was just reading through the questions in the Q&A. Sorry.
So I mean, in terms of principles for a fair work agency, I mean the most the sort of the overarching recommendation from the perspective of this visa is, as I said at the end of my presentation, that to really look at the situation of these workers and listen to what these workers have said are barriers to them reporting. But further than, beyond that, I think, making sure that the agency is well resourced enough to proactively inspect, is not a centralized agency, but is on the ground locally, doing proactive inspections, and the recommendation that Matt said around secure reporting, so that workers know that the remit of the agency is about enforcing employment rights, rather than having, they're completely separate and distinct from immigration enforcement. I think those are two really key things, plus Matt's point about redress, so that workers know that, again, if the agency finds they've been underpaid or not being able to access their rights as workers, there will be actual practical redress for those workers that they receive.
Thank you, Kate. Matt, would you like to continue on?
Yeah, so just building on what Kate said, I think sort of three key principles, which I've already touched on before. Like, I think it's important to have worker voice in the governance structures of the new enforcement body. And what we mean by that is basically having a union voice in the management board, so that they can, or a worker voice, or preferably both, sorry, so that unions can say, well, look, this is where the strategy is failing at the moment. This is where the operations aren't working quite as they should do. This is what you should be doing. And like a practical example of that is charities on the ground flagged up an issue that seasonal workers were unable to transfer to a different farm when they wanted to get better terms and conditions, or where they were facing exploitation. And we found that issue was very difficult to raise with the government through existing structures, because, quite frankly, the previous government wasn't listening to us. Whereas if you have a voice on the board of a new Fair Work Agency, they can raise that issue and get it addressed quickly. I think also another principle is we need more inspectors and more resources. And that doesn't just have to come from the government providing more funding. There are more innovative ways you can do that. So there's existing legislation where you can charge employers for the cost of the investigation in certain situations. So if someone's found to be, if an employer's found to sort of really bad exploitation of workers, why not charge them for the cost of the investigation and pump the money back into the system that way? And then I think also we need to be looking at how to resolve disputes on the ground and not relying on tribunals and enforcement bodies. And I think that's where, if you start getting unions and worker organisations into the workplace with a legal right to do so, that they can do that as well.
Thank you very much. Would any of the other panelists like to add anything to those points raised? Otherwise, I might move on to another question, which I think flows on well from this one, which was, the question was, it's clear from the presenters so far that we learn about some of the problems faced at work, either through research or through workers approaching community centres when they're at risk of destitution or homelessness. Outside kind of the scope of these issues, how can we ensure that workers are actually aware of opportunities for enforcement, particularly if a new government introduces improvements. So I guess summarizing that a little bit, maybe for Mariko or Anita, kind of how can we make sure that workers are actually aware of the avenues available for them? And then maybe as a follow-up to that as well, if maybe you could speak a little bit about how you've kind of built trust with workers in the past and kind of maybe what the government should be aware of in terms of building these networks, building trust with workers so that they are able to go for help when they need them.
Would you like me to go first, Oliver?
Sure, please. Thank you, Anita.
So whilst on the scheme, firstly at the centre we have people all different nationalities. So I've got Russian speakers, Lithuanian, Latvian, Bulgarian, Ukrainian. So it's good, and that's one of the reasons why people engage with us and people trust us. Whilst we were working on the scheme with Flex, I actually went out with a Ukrainian member of staff to the farms, and I actually saw a lot of the issues, as in a supervisor would come out and tell us to clear off. Some of the people on the farm were afraid. We actually, they used to come and get us. We had to go out at night when it was dark, and they'd come and get us and take us up to their caravans, and then we would sit there with them and get the surveys completed. So certainly there's a big, lack of trust. They don't want to engage with anybody if it's because they assume it's to do with immigration. They are worried. Obviously, there's supervisors there. Supervisor will penalise them if they found out that they were filling in surveys. So, it's how do you get that trust? We're very fortunate because we're well established. We've already got the links with the farmers, with GLAA, and other people who are working here. But it's very, very difficult if you come here and you are put down in St Albans and you don't speak English. How do you get that help? So I think there has to be some ground level of support as opposed to just the official. There has to be two channels. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Mariko, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I would like to reiterate what Anita also said, and also for us, our research was conducted by my colleagues who is from Indonesia, who can speak the language, and I think that's that is very important, especially for this seasonal agriculture scheme. The workers are not required to demonstrate the level of English or ability to speak English. So a lot of workers do come here with literally not able to communicate anything in English, and that's also leave them, in a very vulnerable situations, not understanding that the informations around support and opportunities available for them as well. And I think that also comes to the information gap during the recruitment process, because these workers are not often informed about what to do when they face issues, whereas they've been informed about a lot of good things that they can earn money on this, but they haven't really, provided information about how they can protect themselves or where they can seek help. And I think that's somewhere that, we work with some civil society organizations back home, trying to share information and to be able to get the message across for workers even before they come here, or even the families that left behind home countries. I think this is something that also to be included in the consideration of recruitment process, that the workers do have information on opportunities and protections that they can get.
Thank you. Armand, would you have anything to add to the points raised?
Yes, I just wanted to, from my experience, that lots of workers, they were told when they are facing any issues, whether it's wanting to transfer to another farm, or they have a query about the salary, they want to report some, incident at work, the first point of contact is usually their supervisors, and that's exactly where they don't want to go to, because most of the cases never get looked at, never get referred. They just kind of hidden because they don't want to investigate anything, probably out of fear that they might get in trouble themselves. And one really bright example was about the sexual harassment at work. The Uzbekistani lady was reporting, sharing information about this. So the farm didn't want to investigate this because then they would be in trouble themselves. and also the woman would not be able to return next year because if she raised that problem. So I believe there should be an independent, like a third-party organization that the workers could reach out to. I know the workers have some kind of gateway ID provided by the scheme operator, where they can request transfers or request any changes to their terms and conditions of the contract. But I think that's not the right channel for them to go. So there should be some other system in place where they can report issues anonymously. And so the main reason is for them to trust who they are getting in touch with. Also, it would be ideal if it could be done in their native language, or at least in Russian, because most workers are Russian. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much. I had a follow-on question that was raised around the Fair Work Agency. So they asked, how do you ensure meaningful engagement with workers as part of a new Fair Work Agency? And how would workers be involved in any governance and accountability mechanisms so that it is not tokenistic? Would anybody like to tackle that question?
I mean, I can make a start. I mean, I think as Matt and others have outlined, the fact that workers are in the UK on such a short-term restrictive visa makes it really hard to engage them in anything, you know, in any sort of governance mechanism of a future agency. Just it's really difficult with this visa structure. So I think, you know, if things under the current structure, it would have to be a case of, you know, reaching out proactively to workers who are here, reaching out to organisations who work with workers, have provided casework support, understand the workers, the issues workers are facing in practice, use research such as you know, the research today, which has been informed by workers. But you know, ultimately, the visa structure does provide a barrier to direct engagement from workers on a longer term basis in the governance structure of an agency. There are also workers who've returned who might be engaged remotely, but it remains a challenge, just as Matt's explained how it's a challenge for workers on such a short-term visa to unionise.
Thank you, Kate. Would anybody else like to add on to Kate's response?
Sorry, Oliver, do you want me to come in on that as well?
Sure, thank you, please.
So this is something we've been having a look at, and initial thinking is you could have something which is based loosely around the Low Pay Commission, where you have a sort of a mix of employer representatives, academics, and trade union representatives as well. So one way of doing it might be, if the government set up a new executive agency, you could have a management board which sort of guides the executive agency on how they should take decisions. And then, so for example, looking at some Cabinet Office guidance about how to set up new bodies, it says the management board's role is to provide leadership, advise on strategy and the deliverability of policies, maintain high standards of corporate governance, ensure that controls are in place to manage risk, scrutinise performance, and be the forum for self-challenge on how well the agency is achieving its objectives. So it's giving the management board sort of real responsibility in setting the strategic direction of the organisation.
Thank you very much. And another question for the panelists, and Mariko, I think this touches a little bit on what you were mentioning at the start. So obviously we've discussed a lot around the issues faced in the UK. I was wondering if you'd like to share any insights, I guess, into some of the longer term consequences for those on the route and some of the challenges workers face when they get back home as well, just so the government's also aware of some of those issues that they need to be looking at.
Sure. So in a practical level, we have assisted or been in touch with some workers who returned back in Indonesia and found that they overpaid the tax, because when they were here and working in the farm, their pay, the salary automatically deducted their NI contribution. And then when they return to Indonesia, they receive this letter saying, "Oh, we owe you money." But then there is no way that they could get the money back because the HMRC cannot send money to any bank account in Indonesia. And it's very difficult for them the workers to ask the employers to assist this or anything like that. It has been very, very difficult and challenging. And as I said earlier, the workers, even after they went back home, so a lot of them are still haven't paid all the debt back. They still continue to impact their life and their family's life. And I think that's, again, I think it just go back to what Kate has been saying also, that how this 6-month short-term restrictive visa has caused a lot of barriers. And I in our community, we also work a lot with overseas domestic workers who has been in a very similar visa situation of 6 months, very difficult, almost unable to change employers. And we have learned this already over the years or decade. And I think this is something that really, again, I think it goes back to the questions around how we engage workers. And I think the one good things in our community is we have a lot of domestic workers who is very organized, understand the issues of short-term restrictive visas. And, we try to also bring the workers in different sectors together, because a lot of issues that they're facing are quite structurally similar. So I think that's I just wanted to add here as well.
Thank you. Would any of the other speakers like to add on to this question?
Oliver, I would just say that what in our experience in using that case study, as well as others, we didn't find the scheme operators to be particularly helpful. So I think that's an issue, and I don't know where that sits within it. But surely the scheme operators have got to take some responsibility, and to actually tell people to go and find your own work was completely out of order. And yet there was nobody that was willing to address that.
Thank you. So I think we've just got a couple of minutes now. So I thought I'd give an opportunity, I guess, to all the panelist speakers today, if they wanted to perhaps include any kind of closing remarks, any kind of key priorities. There's like a broad question that the government should be looking at moving forward in terms of making this route safer and fairer for workers. I know we've discussed it a little bit before, but if people just wanted to put forward some of the key messages at this stage. Kate, would you like to go first?
I mean, I think the key, one of the key messages is that as we've heard throughout the session today, the scheme is now quite well established. It's been in place since 2019. Well, it's been in place earlier than that in other iterations, but this time around it's been in place since it was a pilot in 2019. There's been documented risks to the scheme since it was established. There is now a commitment that it will remain in place till 2029. So I think, in this context where the scheme has been committed to, there's a strong consensus that these workers are really essential to the UK's horticultural industry. And we have a government who has strong stated commitments to workers' rights. Now is absolutely a key time to be making sure that the structure of the scheme is really scrutinised to make sure that all workers on the scheme, the scheme is safe and fair for them, and they really do have access to their rights in practice. So that's a sort of broad overarching statement on the scheme, rather than again going through the details. But fundamental to that is looking at the visa and checking that it well, if it's too restrictive, as we've seen, workers really, you end up mitigating situations rather than really making sure that the workers have enough options to really enable them to access their rights. So I think that's the sort of fundamental step to look at the nature of the visa itself and its restrictions. particularly the duration, because as Matt says, it's a seasonal worker visa, but workers are coming all year round.
Thank you, Kate. Would anybody else like to share their thoughts? Otherwise, if nobody else had any additional points, I think we can end the Q&A section here. I just wanted to say thank you to all the speakers today, and also to all of those who attended the session and are listening in. Hopefully this was very insightful for everybody, and it's great to be able to, I guess, have such a wide range of panelists to kind of speak through some of these issues and the opportunities moving forward. As was kind of put in the chat, we do have a series of research publications that have recently been out. They're also available on Flex's website. If you have any questions about the research or our policy work, we also have contact details available for, I think, myself and Kate available on the website as well. But my email is oliver.fisher@labourexploitation.com if you do have any questions about any of the reports or our ongoing work. And if you're interested more broadly in our ongoing work at Flex as well, you can also sign up to the newsletter on our website also. So yeah, thank you once again for everybody for attending today. And yes, we'll end the session here. Thank you.